Fate is, as I often seem to end up just talking about in these episodes of Chronicles, an enormous part of Romeo and Juliet. When in the prologue it talks about them being star-crossed lovers, right? It intends the idea that actually heaven above has plans for these two people, right? That their destiny is one way or another to end this feud. And obviously what ends up happening is that they end up taking their own lives, and through the sheer tragedy of what has happened, Capulet and Montague make up for the first time, I suppose, and actually set the feud aside. And what's more, the golden statues that they erect in memory of their two children gives us some sort of sign actually that actually the memory of what has happened as well will also hold, so that future generations of these households aren't doomed to repeat the same mistakes that the generations have come before have. Shakespeare's use of language with star-crossed and heavenly imagery is something that continues throughout the dialogue of the play. To speak in heavenly terms is to speak to something that can transcend the temporal strife that sets about on the streets of Verona, right? Romeo and Juliet seeking a love that seems to be as eternal and as everlasting as a feud on their very streets seems to do. But in finding love, you actually have a higher beauty that, like heaven, is incorruptible and cannot be torn asunder by the ambitions and trappings of pride and social status that, of course, we have to live in and find our way through in this earthly presence. We also, in this first scene, get our first brief introduction to Lord Montague and Lord Capulet. Now, within this play, much more page time is dedicated to Capulet than Montague, and so we get a much greater understanding of who he is as a man. However, with Montague in this particular first opening, we also see that he is not so much different to the others, that he is still willing to draw his sword out on the street, old man as he is, in order to defend the honour of his family and its name. There's almost a comic idea to these two old geriatric men being held back by their also very old wives as they're trying to go at one another in the middle of the street. We also gain within this some idea that actually Montague is himself, he does love Romeo deeply. He obviously is a father that loves his son, but also he doesn't quite understand him. Romeo is somewhat different to the other Montagues, and that is evidenced by the fact that he's not in this initial fight with them, right? Romeo is off elsewhere, whilst all of the members of the Montague family are present for this first brawl, and it's very much the same for the Capulets, other than Juliet, of course, and other very minor secondary characters like the cousin, and so on. But you see within this, Montague speaks of Romeo's melancholy. He knows that his son is deeply troubled and down about something, but he doesn't understand what it is. And Benvolio, as his cousin, as Romeo's cousin, assures him that he will work to try and find out the truth of Romeo's trouble so that he might, of course, help him out. And then we are introduced to Romeo, the most famous lover of all of literature, most likely. And so Romeo is a young, very fickle, very brash character, yet he has all of the hallmarks that you would expect from a young man, right? In some ways, he is the eternal young man. Despite being young and brash, he is a great wit, and he loves to banter with his friends, right? He banters with Benvolio, he banters with Mercutio. He's full of youthful bravado and sexual innuendo. But also, what's more as well, we see in the character of Romeo that actually this fickleness and the way that he changes on a dime from being lovesick over Rosaline into loving Juliet created a lot of problems down the centuries for many a writer and actor, because they, for some reason, particularly in the Georgian era, I believe it was, any mention of Rosaline is entirely done away with, and Shakespeare's plays was altered in some decades because they didn't like the fact that Romeo changes in his love so quickly from one woman to another, and they thought that it somewhat undermined the point of the play, and in that way that Juliet is not so extraordinary a woman and just happens to be the latest woman that Romeo has set his eyes on. But I personally think this interpretation is wrong, and I think that even though she doesn't actually turn up in the play, but her mentioning and the explanation of why Romeo is so down at the beginning is so important to understanding his character and why it works in the sense of the tragedy. We're then introduced in Act 1, Scene 2, once again to Lord Capulet, and also to the County Paris. Now, Paris is a secondary character in the play, and obviously is someone that is set up to be Juliet's suitor. He's certainly someone that the family are pushing in Juliet's direction. And actually, there's quite a lot to say about this, because in Act 1, Scene 2, we are told that Juliet is Capulet's only daughter, she's his only child, and obviously, therefore, it is imperative that he match her up with someone appropriate. And Paris, as it happens, turns out to be the kin of the prince himself. And so it's very interesting here, because when you look at Capulet's character throughout the play, you actually see a very well-respected, very well-regarded patriarch of his family. He is very, very warm to the people that he's surrounded by. And when you see him at the masquerade, the way that he reminisces about the good old days with his cousin and just recounts like former masquerades that they've had and their old days of romance, right? There is a likable man at the heart of this. And something else to Capulet's credit is, of course, the fact that during the masquerade, when Tybalt sees Romeo and wishes to attack him and do away with him for trespassing on their premises, Capulet says nay. A wonderful aspect to the character of Capulet, I find, is the fact that for every reading that you can have of Capulet as a very honourable and decent man, I feel like Shakespeare also just gives you enough to just actually see beneath the surface a very, very shrewd operator. So because you have the character of Paris, you can see that the prince, as a neutral party, is someone who is obviously neither going to favour one side or another, and that was all displayed very, very well in the first act. However, if Capulet can marry his daughter to the prince's kinsman, then he can tip that neutrality in the Capulet's favour, and thereby, of course, set himself up as the stronger and more dominant house, and so finally come out on top of this feud in the end. And so, despite the fact that he was brash at the beginning, taking his sword out when he saw his men being attacked, you see as well within the play a very, very shrewd operator. It's also entirely possible as well that the reason that he stays Tybalt's hand in the masquerade is because of the sheer bad optics of what that would mean for a fight to break out, of course, on his premises at his own party. And what's more, to know that a Montague dared to trespass on his property in the first place. And so I think there are many a reason to have a more cynical reading of Capulet's character. However, I do think he is still a very strong presence in the play, and whenever he is in the room, it is very obvious that he is the highest power and the highest status character within any scene that he's in. We're also introduced in Scene 3 to, of course, Juliet. And Juliet is, I think, a very remarkable character. I know I'm just supposed to say that because it's Romeo and Juliet, but I genuinely do. Some of the very first lines that Juliet says is the mother gets a nurse to call for her. Juliet comes, she asks who is asking, it's a mother, and Juliet says something to the effect of, "Mother, what is your will?" Right? And so we see at the very beginning of the story, we see a 13-year-old girl who is remarkably compliant to her mother's will and merely exists as an extension as that family's will. She is dutiful, she's kindly spoken, she reveres her parents greatly and their higher wisdom. And what we see is, through her love, someone coming to understand things through her own eyes and have her own ideas about the world. And of course, these end up running in sharp contradiction to the wishes of her own family. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of this is innately good, but what I am saying is that with Juliet, Shakespeare gives you a very clear character arc that Juliet goes through, from someone with seemingly very little agency at all in the very introduction to someone at the end with possibly the most agency out of anyone in the play, to the point that she decides to take her own life to find eternal peace with Romeo and her love. When Capulet sends forth his messenger out into the street, and I realise that I'm backtracking on the chronology a bit, but when he sends the messenger Peter out into the street, and Romeo of course sees the invitation that Rosaline, who is Juliet's cousin, is going to be at the party, at the masquerade, he of course wants to go. And the thing about Romeo and his quest for Rosaline to begin with is that it starts out seemingly very purposefully generic. When Romeo speaks of Rosaline, he speaks in what you would call a Petrarchian sonnet. Now, Francesco di Petracchio was an Italian scholar and poet from the 14th century, and it was his style of sonnet, the 14-line sonnet, that would then go on to take his name, the Petrarchian sonnet, that was very popular at the time. And usually these sonnets in theme were talking about unrequited love, right? And the idea that there was someone unobtainable, but nonetheless you have this great devotion to them. And this is very much the way that Romeo speaks about Rosaline, because we learn through Romeo's sulking to Benvolio that Rosaline has chosen a life of chastity and therefore is off limits to Romeo. And Romeo makes no bones about the fact that this is a love of deep sexual desire. And what's more, Petracchio had his own Rosaline, which was a woman by the name of Laura, that was this person that he set into the heavens, right? Again, has this heavenly language to it, that they are somehow, their beauty, their love is divine, it is otherworldly. Now, of course, this is also a very prominent feature of Arthurian tales as well. The idea of courtly love, admiring someone, loving someone from afar. But Romeo, of course, doesn't want this because he's a young man and he's very hormonal. And of course, he wants something much more intimate and much more fiery. But what's curious is that when Romeo finally meets Juliet in Act 1, Scene 5, he meets her, and their first lines of dialogue, even though their first encounter is remarkably brief, the way that Shakespeare uses the language is that they both complete a Petrarchian sonnet together, right? So they both share in the lines of it. And in form, the Petrarchian sonnet goes A, B, B, A, B, B, A in its rhyming. So the two lovers both complete this together. And so through the use of language, through poetry, Shakespeare is conveying how actually this love that he has with Juliet is not unrequited love, but actually one that is entirely reciprocal. And you see in the two fusing together to create this sonnet the two hearts fusing together at the same time. And of course, the idea of love at first sight is a very, very popular trope, and something that I think even the most cynical person may deeply wish to be true. There is a great romance to it. The idea that when you see someone, you kind of just know. And I know people in my own life who say that that is how I think it speaks to the purity of the ideal, that there are still people, even today, in an age of great cynicism, who believe in no higher power, that actually, in some way, the universe has forged two people together for some sense of destiny, that they were simply meant to be. And that is, of course, what seems to be the case with these two young lovers. In fact, in Act 1, Scene 4, when Romeo is with Benvolio Mercutio and his friends on the way to the masque, he even says the line, "I fear too early, for my mind misgives, some consequence yet hanging in the stars." Right? There's this sense of foreboding, of fate. Now, Romeo interprets this as a negative thing, right? And indeed, he actually turns out to be entirely vindicated, of course, because this love that he's about to encounter ends up being the source of his death. However, that doesn't mean that it didn't also burn remarkably brightly for the amount of time that it was real.
If you enjoyed this piece of premium content from the Lotus Eaters, head to our website where you can find more.